Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. A Bangladesh court convicts ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of crimes against humanity over last year's deadly student crackdown. The verdict follows a months-long trial that found she ordered the security response to the uprising. Presidents Macron and Zelensky sign a letter of intent for Ukraine to acquire up to 100 Rafale fighter jets and new air defense systems from French firms. Paris says the deal, spanning around 10 years, includes future contracts for SAMP-T systems, radars and drones to bolster Ukraine's war effort. At least 45 Indian pilgrims are dead after a bus crash near Medina in Saudi Arabia, with only one survivor undergoing treatment. Indian officials say a 24/7 control room is now active in Jeddah as Telangana's chief minister seeks urgent coordination with Riyadh. Japan scrambles fighter aircraft after a suspected Chinese drone flies between Yonaguni Island and Taiwan. Tokyo says the incident comes just days after Prime Minister Takaichi's comments on Taiwan heightened tensions with Beijing. The death toll from a Russian missile strike on Balaklia in eastern Ukraine rises to 3, with 10 others wounded overnight. Local officials say the attack hit the city during the night and emergency crews are still working at the scene. Germany says it will lift restrictions imposed in August on arms exports to Israel that could be used in the Gaza conflict. Berlin says the move follows new assessment of Israel's security needs. South Korea's military proposes talks with the North to avoid further border clashes after recent incursions by North Korean troops. Seoul says it wants both sides to set a clear reference line along the military demarcation line to prevent accidental confrontations. Leftist candidate Jeanette Jara takes a narrow lead with 27% in Chile's first-round election, with far-right rival Jose Antonio Cast at 24%, despite trailing. Cast remains favoured to win the runoff as crime and immigration dominate a deeply divided electorate. Now, those are the headlines of the hour, but we start this hour in the Indo-Pacific. China's Ministry of Defense has strongly urged the United States to cease its arms sales to Taiwan, warning that such actions could negatively impact the development of military relations between the two countries. In a statement, the Chinese Defense Ministry expressed its dissatisfaction with the United States' support for Taiwan's defense capabilities, which it views as a violation of China's sovereignty. The ministry further confirmed that it has lodged formal protests with the United States government over these sales. In response, China reiterated its commitment to safeguarding its sovereignty and territorial integrity and warned that it would take all necessary measures to protect its national interests. This comes after the US approved a $330 million arms sale to Taiwan, including fighter jets and aircraft parts, marking the first such transaction since Donald Trump took office in January. The Pentagon stated that the sale would enhance Taiwan's ability to maintain the operational readiness of its F-16, C-130 and other aircraft, helping to address both current and future security threats. We're now joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst and he joins us live from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to have you here on the programme. How might Taiwan take these comments from the Chinese ministry, expressing dissatisfaction with this huge purchase of military equipment from the Americans?
This is just part of the normal give and take back and forth between China, Taiwan, and the United States. The United States has always sold weapons, or in this case, it's spare parts, it's not new weapon systems, to Taiwan, and the United States will continue to do so. Now, it's possible that Trump may have delayed making these kinds of announcements over the course of 2025 in the hopes of reaching a trade deal with China, and he didn't want to disrupt that process, but he had his meeting with Xi Jinping. They did reach some agreements on trade issues. They're still negotiating a lot of the specifics, but maybe the Trump administration now feels it has some flexibility to proceed. Now, this is a relatively small sale, actually. It's only a little over 300 million US dollars. And the expectations are that in the coming weeks or months, actually, the Trump administration is going to approve a very significant weapons sales to Taiwan valued in the billions of dollars. So the big sale is really yet to come. And of course, China will react negatively to that when it does happen.
Yeah, and what can you tell us about Taiwan's current defense capabilities? And of course, how Donald Trump has approached the situation, that tension between China and Taiwan?
Historically, President Trump has taken a similar approach to that which he's taken with other countries, whether that's NATO members, South Korea, Japan, and others, which is to say you're not spending enough on your own defense. Now, in the first Trump administration, Taiwan purchased approximately $20 billion of weapons from the United States, and actually many of those have yet to be delivered so many years later, which does cause some frustration here in Taiwan. But the expectation, again, is that the Trump administration will continue to sell billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan. And this is not just about helping the profits of U.S. weapons manufacturers or creating jobs in the United States. There actually is a genuine concern that Taiwan has underinvested in its defense over the past 25 or so years, and Taiwan is trying to catch up. To be fair to the Taiwan government, they are seeking a much larger defense budget from the parliament here in 2026. So the government does recognize the need to significantly increase its defense spending given the nature of the threat from China.
Yeah, and Bros, and Beijing has warned that this deal will damage US-China military relations. What does that mean? Cancel dialogues or something more serious?
Yeah, usually that's what it means. It does mean cancel dialogues. And what happens after that is the United States typically will go back to China and ask to resume those dialogues, and China will say no for quite a long time until they could link it to something else, whether that's trade or other issues. So yeah, it's possible that China could turn off some of those dialogues, but given the tensions that exist between the two sides, one could legitimately ask, what do those dialogues really achieve? Although those dialogues do have their supporters as well. It's the typical justification is to say that it reduces the likelihood of misunderstandings between the two sides. In the past, there used to be things like port calls. U.S. Navy ships would visit Hong Kong or even ports in China. But over the past few years of tensions, that has disappeared as well. So most likely, when it comes to military relations, China will cut off certain dialogue platforms.
Yes, Ross Feingold, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of the Indo-Pacific. And China's Vice Premier He Lifeng and German Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil have agreed that the two countries should strengthen commercial ties and bring an end to months of trade tensions between the world's largest economies. Klingbeil met He in Beijing on the first visit to China by a minister from Chancellor Friedrich Merz's government. Ties between the two industrial powerhouses have been strained over Chinese export curbs on chips and rare earths in particular, causing major disruptions for German firms. Klingbeil says that Germany addressed the topic of Chinese overcapacity in key sectors such as steel, solar and electric mobility during talks at the China-Germany Financial Dialogue, an event which is held every 2 years for German and Chinese officials and corporate executives to exchange their views. Ross Feingold joins us once again. Ross, Germany, of course, says that it wants to end trade tensions with China, but can that realistically happen while Beijing still holds all these export cards on chips and rare earths, for example?
there are a number of issues in this trade relationship that make it contentious, including the ones you just mentioned, such as the export of rare earths from China to Europe and specifically Germany, this issue of overcapacity in Chinese goods that are often inexpensive, which doesn't mean that they're low quality, but they are competitively priced, and it's difficult for European manufacturers to compete. And then that has to be balanced against some German companies, not just large companies, but also small and medium enterprise is in Germany, which have such an excellent reputation around the world. They have a market in China as well. So it's not just the big companies like a Volkswagen, a BMW, Mercedes, or a BASF that have big business in China, but lots of German companies want to sell to China, and for a long time their goods have been in demand in China. So it's a tough balance, and then there's the pressure from the United States and pressure from other European partners as well. But who's ever in power in Germany, it doesn't matter if it's the left or the right, when they try to decouple or make moves towards decoupling, they immediately hear it from the German exporters who say we need to be in China. We actually like this market and we make money there.
Yes, Ross Feingold, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World, and thank you very much for taking the time, of course. We now move on over to Europe, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Ukraine may explore the possibility of co-producing Rafale fighter jets with France in the future. This comes after he signed a deal with France for 100 Rafale fighter jets to enhance Ukraine's defensive capabilities against Russia. Zelensky's remarks were made during a visit to Paris, where he met with the French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss military support and diplomatic efforts to end the war. Macron expressed hope that peace between Ukraine and Russia could be achieved by 2027, emphasizing France's continued financial and military backing for Kyiv. Macron also confirmed a major contract with French company Alstom, valued at 475 million euros, which is part of Ukraine's broader push for EU integration. Additionally, Macron reiterated his confidence in Zelensky's efforts to combat corruption and strengthen Ukraine's rule of law as part of EU membership processes. Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Asta Chadha. She's at Ritsu Meidkan University, and she's a professor of international relations. She joins us live from Kyoto. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Chadha, here on NewsX World. President Zelensky says Ukraine could eventually co-produce these jets with France. Realistically, how feasible is that when Ukraine's defense is still under attack on nearly a daily basis by Moscow?
Thank you, Thomas, for having me here on NewsX. I mean, see, if you read the letter of intent that was signed, it's a long-term deal. It's a 10-year-long aspiration on part of Ukraine to develop those capabilities, but also it's a very long-term political commitment on part of France. So it's not just a short-term military aid that France is providing. Now, given the fact that they are aiming at a 2027 possible peace, I think more than the peace aspect, what's highlighted through this deal is that France and a lot of other European partners, the so-called coalition of the willing European partners, they are willing to embolden and make sure that Ukraine has its own defense capabilities, right, in the longer term, because looks like none of these players are expecting a peace anytime soon. As far as the possibility of Ukraine being completely independently capable of developing those defense capabilities, I mean, I think it's going to take more than a decade for sure. Like you said, it's been under attack for a long time. That being said, there are other smaller steps that are being taken within this letter of intent, and one of those is joint co-development of drones, for instance. I mean, those are the kind of capabilities that would take lesser time to develop, and I'm sure, I mean, given that there is a lot of political monetary commitment on part of Europe as a whole and France in particular, I'm sure that's what they're looking at. And then the third aspect of this deal is the fact that US, and especially under President Trump, has consistently mentioned that European partners need to take more burden of this. So this should be seen as the European way and the French way of assuring both United States and Ukraine that their long-term European security is it's going to be a function of long-term Ukrainian security.
Yeah, and how significant is it that Macron's commitment that peace with Russia could be possible by 2027? Is that diplomatic optimism here?
I mean, yes, it does sound like a little too much of optimism, because remember that last time there was a dialogue held with regard to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia was not even party to that dialogue. And I mean, realistically speaking, unless both the parties that are engaged in this conflict are brought to the table and, the terms of peace are discussed, it's very unlikely that a long-term sustainable peace can be achieved. Though something in the short run, such as, some sort of a halt to a temporary one to the conflict is possible, but that does not guarantee a long-term peace in any way. So I do not think, they have, whether, they are sure whether by 2027 this can be achieved. For sure, what can be achieved is more commitment, both monetary, political, by Europe, probably roping in United States for further commitment into Ukrainian security, and possibly launching new dialogues or launching new platforms wherein Russia is brought as a stakeholder in the long-term European conflict rather than being treated as an outsider.
Yes, Dr. Chadha, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of West Asia. This time, and Syrian authorities plan to hand over jihadist fighters from China's Uyghur minority to Beijing, as Damascus Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani makes his first visit to China. Many of the Uyghur fighters joined the Turkestan Islamic Party in Syria after the 2011 war, primarily in Idlib province. A Syrian source said Damascus intends to transfer the fighters in batches, with China rejecting their integration into Syria's new army. Reports indicate that around 400 Uyghurs could be handed over in the coming period. China's top diplomat Wang Yi expressed support for Syria in achieving peace, while China's foreign ministry confirmed that Syria has pledged not to allow its territory to be used against Chinese interests. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says between 3,200 and 4,000 Uyghur fighters remain in Syria, some integrated into the new army as a division. Joining us once again is Dr. Chadha. Damascus now to hand over these Uyghur fighters to China. Is this about counter-terrorism or about something else?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on its head. I mean, this looks less like, if we follow what has been China's relations with Syria, if you take a long-term view, you'll notice that China has been very less interested in the peace per se in Syria, and more interested in these fighters and East Turkestan Islamic Movement fighters, specifically the ones that have been integrated into the army or that have made their ways into the defense and the security forces of Syria, because, they do pose a huge security threat to China, specifically given its own internal conditions with regard to Uyghur population. That's one. Two, given that China was very hesitant in January 2025 to recognize the Syrian government in transition, the fact that China is now ready to cooperate with them, specifically calling for an inclusive political transition in Syria, shows that they are very much invested in this security and in this particularly anti-terrorism aspect of Syria, rather than long-term Syrian security within or any democratic movement.
Yes, and Dr. Chadha, China has said that Syria has pledged not to allow its territory to be used against Chinese interests. What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, I think China's concern, like I mentioned, was, to try and push this anti-terrorism cooperation with Syria and Syrian government in transition, specifically aiming at its broader strategy of playing more active role in Middle Eastern politics and diplomacy. That's one. And second, the closer the cooperation in terms of anti-terrorism, the higher, the Chinese weight in terms of making sure that Uyghur-linked terror groups, do not get the kind of leverage they have previously received in Syria in any way. And third, by doing this kind of a, this sort of a probably a medium-term anti-terrorism cooperation with the Syrian government in transition, China would most probably try and tie together its any future aid or infrastructure investments to this counter-terrorism cooperation, rather than for development or very, economic-focused cooperation in Syria.
Yes, and of course, Chinese government and the Uyghurs have an extremely complicated relationship with some serious accusations against the Chinese government. What do we know about the fate of these fighters once they are transferred to China? Do you think there'll be any guarantees against abuse or forced disappearances?
I mean, it's anybody's guess. We've all heard the news that has come out of China, specifically with regards to, Xinjiang and the Uyghur population. So, if China really does look at these fighters more as terrorists or people trying to in some way disrupt the domestic peace, they would probably be dealt with exactly the way the rest of the population is being dealt with inside China. But, one more important aspect of this is if China were to actually get this deal and get, those fighters into the Chinese territory and then have the right to treat them the way it does treat dissidents or anyone trying to disrupt, domestic order, this would in some way seal an alternative to Western-led security order, because China's engagement in Syria and specifically in terms of counterterrorism would be seen as both political and as well as long-term security related. And this in a way does provide or does showcase that China has its own idea of the aspect of its own sovereignty, but plus the extent to which it wants to practice this non-interventionist principle, as long as any dissidents or anyone that China considers as a terrorist or somebody who's a threat is transferred, and as long as they can strike those kind of deals with very vulnerable states across Middle East.
Yes, Dr. Chatter, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the programme. We now move on, and gunmen from a criminal gang have kidnapped 25 people and killed a staff member in an early morning raid on a northwestern Nigerian girls' school. The latest attack comes more than a decade after nearly 300 girls were abducted from Chibok in the restive northeastern region and sparked international outcry. Since then, there has been a string of other abductions involving school children. As per the local police, the armed gang with sophisticated weapons shooting sporadically stormed the government girls' comprehensive secondary school in Kebbi State. The deputy school head was also shot dead, while a security guard was injured during the abduction. The police have said that the military, police, tactical units and local vigilantes have been deployed in the area and that they are currently combing the bandits' routes and nearby forest in a bid to rescue the abducted students and arrest the gangs. And that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more updates from around the globe. Thank you.